Good day. This is John Spink. I'm director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an assistant professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And that's within the food safety program. And also applicable to this lecture is I'm an adjunct professor in our School of Packaging, and I actually have a packaging PhD finished in 2009, and I'm the 34th ever in the history of the galaxy, I guess. So that's for what it's worth, that's a good starting point when we're going to talk about packaging. A couple things I'd like to point out is we've got the chat box and then also the questions. And so at least at the end of each section, I will look for if any questions come up. So today, we're going to cover the food fraud overview and compliance requirements for packaging. So if you followed any of our work before, we focus on food fraud, policy and strategy. We don't have a testing lab. We don't do much else but focus on the real core basics of getting the requirements together and then putting the policies and strategies in place, and do a lot in that area. A lot is looking at the foundation setting and things like working with GFSI. So that's been a real key, and I think something where we can add a lot of value to the marketplace. Our focus is on compliance, and that's first, second, and third party audits or reviews, really. So this applies to a company that's trying to meet compliance requirements and build upon that to actually build a system that is protecting their products in the marketplace. Second party audits, so being some either internal auditors, sometimes that's an accountant that is not really aware of the details of the business, and so we help focus on educating them a bit on what they can look for, and also it could be an outsider that comes in and helps a company to meet those requirements. And then another aspect is the third-party audit. So people that are coming in and judging and really ranking for the certification for a food safety management system, or other types of audits as well. So what we'll do here is we'll end with the questions. There's basically 7 questions, yes or no questions at this point, that are the most efficient for a third-party auditor to ask. And it sounds ridiculously simple, incompetent, and too simplistic to just ask those basic questions, but you'll see that that's the optimal role because it's just starting the process. The GFSI requirements for food fraud and food defense also came in place only January 1st of this year. So we're 10 weeks into food fraud and food defense. You think about HACCP as 20+ years. So these type of the insights, the expertise we have, how we're going to hold people accountable, best practices, benchmarking is going to be a lot different in another 10 weeks, in 10 months, and 10 years, obviously. So this is a starting point. So that's what we'll do today. Is we will then we'll go through this and give you a bit of an overview. So first off, let's just quickly look at what is packaging. So it's a container itself. So we're trying to look at what will hold that product. Closures. So it's not just that, we think sometimes of the package itself. Now my PhD is in packaging science, so this is near and dear to me, all aspects of it. And so the closures are our key there as well. Secondary and tertiary packaging, meaning say it's a bag of cereal. That would be the inner bag, would be the primary package, and then secondary could be that carton, or then the shipping container, even the pallet, and think about the wrap on the outside. Covers and wraps, so that's it, of things that are really holding the bigger component of it together. Labels. A lot of times we don't think about this. We just think labels are just really a part of the container itself, but labels have multiple functions, and it's really communication, and there's an awful lot of communication on that label. Performance criteria. So this is actually how the package performs. So it could be the permeability, its ability to hold oxygen in or release gases. It could be structural. How high can you stack it? Tamper resistance or security. That's a big one. When you start to have tamper evident features or the anti-counterfeiting features on there, then there starts to be a lot higher level of technology required. And statement of attributes. So this is more of a credence attribute, we would say. So if you say that the paperboard is 100% reclaimed paperboard, then that's a statement. You know, with a food product, that would be things like organic or country of origin. So these are all parts of the package and things that must be considered under the GFSI requirements for the package and packaging. Now, in 2012, so quite a while ago, well, I guess I don't know if you think it's a while ago or not, but in 2012, the GFSI Board of Directors created a food fraud think tank. No, task. We were think tank. I guess we were a think tank, and there were 4 of us at the start that were invited on that, and then 2 more additions, so 6 total. And they were asked. They asked us to review what is food fraud and if it should be something addressed under GFSI. And they concluded that it was, because food fraud and food defense could be a root cause of a future food safety incident. And that's real key. The GFSI system is really a quality management system, not just an incident response system. So the definition that GFSI put in there was fraud, including the subcategory of economically motivated adulteration. It's of growing concern, the deception of consumers in food products, ingredients, and packaging. There it is, right there. So right in early on, the in GFSI, packaging was identified as one of the areas where there could be fraud occurring for economic gain, and then the types of fraud, which include actually all types of fraud, any type of fraud with the product, stolen goods, counterfeit, smuggling, and then the normal kind of adulterant substances that we have. So GFSI is looking very broadly at this topic. Now, something that you might not have considered, maybe you have, but with packaging, there's this function, and there's a lot of things that you might not consider. And what we've got here is a range of activities, tamper evident and tamper resistant. So the package needs to perform in a certain way. Now, a packaging company, if they do have a tamper evident or tamper resistant requirement, there are Consumer Product Safety Commission and other types of performance measurements, performance tests that they need to do. Child resistant as well, to look at how resistant it is there. Universal design is a unique design of a package that makes it easy for more people to open, such as with arthritis, and that's actually a function. So there could be a specification that package needs to have this universal design attribute, and sometimes then they're not. A fraudulent company would make it look that way, but it's really not there. Another type of convenience or marketing designs, and also anti-theft. This could be shoplifting and now cargo theft. Your entire truckloads of product are stolen. So these are all different parts of the package that we may consider a part of that functionality. Now, GFSI is going to focus on the health hazards, but as a company, you need to focus on, the manufacturers need to focus on all aspects, and the company that's receiving it, the buyer, they would want to have that child-resistant, tamper-evident, or especially the tamper-evident, tamper-resistant features, because that will protect the product from fraud farther down the line. Now, another thing to look at is where packaging is in the supply chain. So it's one thing if you've got unfilled new packages that are going to be filled, and you'll see that on the left here. That's with ingredients coming in. That's where there's a major focus for GFSI in these packaging requirements, because it's production of packaging. But then the package itself has other roles in the in fraud prevention in the supply chain, and you'll see as the product moves through the supply chain, you need to have that package continue to perform its function to contain, or the other types of permeability, shelf life, things like that. And so there's other attributes at the end of the line. But also you could see things here like repackaging, unauthorized repackaging. There could be product that gets damaged, and so that could get destroyed in the marketplace. So packaging has a role across the spectrum. Now this in the middle is the legitimate supply chain that's in control. Above is contract manufacturers and others. So actually, I'm looking in my office, we have some stackable boxes from a oil company's antifreeze coolant, and these we just got from a moving company that had extra cartons. So the box company had an overrun of some kind and just sold it. So I've got these legitimate, genuine packages here that I just think that's kind of comical for me, for what I do. So that's contract manufacturers, control of that package, because that package, this is a genuine carton, genuine case of 4 6 1-gallon containers. So, if you were to look at it from the outside, it could be, considered genuine. So you want to control those. The packaging company would want to control the printed packaging, and then finished product outside the supply chain. So there's counterfeiters that counterfeit the whole thing, that just make a product that looks almost exactly the same. Now, one thing that is one of the most unique threats is if someone steals, say, a truckload of empty packages. Think about rolls of a chocolate bar, film rolls of a chocolate bar. There could be thousands and thousands of genuine packages there on that truck if it got stolen. So with this, we really do need to look, the brand owner really needs to look across the entire supply chain, and then we split it up to see where are the different parts for the package. Now we'll look, before getting into the overall food fraud actual requirements, we'll look at the overall requirements in GFSI for the production of food packaging. One thing for a company, if you sell into the food industry, you are in the food industry. You can't just say, oh, we're just a packaging company, you guys figure that out. No, they're going to hold you accountable, and even the legal liability of that product under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and others can come upstream to you as a packaging company. So we'll look at the GFSI requirements. This is Part 3, Section M. So what we're looking at is what is the package and packaging? And so the package is the container and the components. And usually when people say packaging, such as in this case, they mean everything around the types of package. But a lot of times for us, we'll call packaging the actual process of filling. So we just need to be clear that we're really looking at the package here, or the different package components. And then there's 3 different entities in the supply chain here. One is the package seller, the person that's producing that product and selling it to someone that's going to fill it. That's the focus of GFSI here, the production of food packaging. But there's also requirements in other parts of GFSI for the package buyer to make sure that this product is being procured in a controlled way. And then there's a package user. So when anybody that uses a package, it then has a role in the rest of the entire GFSI system, including through retailers. Retailers have to worry about the package because that's a part of the products they have on the shelf. Really, the basic requirement for a package company is the same as everybody else. The requirement is HACCP, TACCP, and VASCP. So HACCP is a HACCP program looking for food safety threats and risks. TACCP is a threat assessment for food defense. We'll cover this in great detail later. And VASCP is a vulnerability assessment for food fraud. Now, don't get too worried yet. It sounds like the world just got extremely complex for you, but it really didn't. In a lot of cases, what you really need to do with your entire product slate is you need to do some type of assessment to identify what are the problems. Now, a lot of times you just kind of in your head say, well, that's not really a big problem. We never heard of it. No one said we have to deal with it. So there's all of a sudden things that are not being, you're not addressing them because you kind of do a gut check on it. But really with GFSI and with the Food Safety Modernization Act, and really with Sarbanes-Oxley as well for financial reporting, you really need to have some type of method. Now, you could have a very broad method to say that all of the packaging coming in is low from a food fraud and food defense standpoint because we buy it directly from the supplier and they have supply chain programs or things like that. Well, that is a method for an assessment. So we'll get into that. And basically the same requirements apply for a food manufacturer as do for the rest of the supply chain, just maybe on a lighter scale. So we'll look at the scheme, scope, and key elements. And we say scheme, but now getting to the certification programs, but we'll go into the details here. So this is directly from GFSI. The first thing, look here, is requirements for the food safety management system. So for the production of food packaging, there does need to be a food safety management system. That's the bottom line there. The second is good practice requirements. So this is about how you handle product and manufacture product, good manufacturing practices. And the third is requirements for HACCP, or these HACCP-based requirements. HACCP is overall food safety, and here it really looks at the broader scope for GFSI. So food safety management system is really built upon your good manufacturing practices. If you expand them, then you may be able to be covered with that. And then HACCP is just the real process of looking at hazards and controlling them in your system. That's within the food safety management system. So scope from GFSI as well. So these are now the details of what is in the what is covered by GFSI. Production of food and feed packaging. So it's the production, you're manufacturing the package for food and feed. Packaging materials, so it's how you're producing it. So if you have a really dirty fill line, then that's going to be a problem for food packaging. Then the packaging materials themselves. So the plastic that you buy that doesn't have heavy metal residues or something like that. Packaging components. So now these are the pieces, that's the materials, the raw materials, and now the components. Once you make a bottle, a cap, a label, and all these different things they're looking for the raw materials, part processed, semi-converted, converted, fully packaging materials, and all those products are going to be used in the supply chain. So it covers all types of packaging and even including the materials themselves and the production. Now, specific requirements for the seller. So you that's the manufacturer of the product. Look, this is a food safety management system, but it's for packaging materials. So you really are very fortunate because there's an awful lot out there published. Just look on the internet for that. You can find a lot of information on the food safety management systems. So you can use that as a base for your production. Now yours is going to be much simpler than manufacturing a food product. So you'll be able to whittle that down into something a lot more manageable. But that's the key, is this food safety management system. And again, as I mentioned before, there's really three aspects: HACCP, TACCP, and VACCP. And the requirements under those are an assessment and a prevention plan. We'll get into that more detailed a little bit later. But again, this is what's required. And then now that you've got this overall structure, you can start filling it in and figuring out what you need to do to be compliant. Now, before going into the details of GFSI, we'll look at other requirements for a packaging, and one is for a package buyer. And if you look here for purchasing, so this is in the this actually would require to be required for you buying packaging materials, say raw materials. Standards shall require that the organization, this is highlighted because GFSI is about the organization, not just about the site. It's not just about your manufacturing facility. It's about how your company does business and how your company operates. So the standard shall require that the organization controls the supply chain management processes. That would be, so the plant might not be the ones that actually are the buyers of the product. Corporate might be the buyer that deals with the plastic company or something, and that have the effect on safe food packaging materials. So this is the process of buying that, bringing it in. And right there in that same long sentence is including food fraud mitigation plan requirements. Now, food defense is included as well. They didn't mention that, but food fraud, including food fraud. So as we're getting into food fraud, it could not be any more clear that they expect food fraud for these materials to be managed all the way up at the corporate level. And again, not just the facility, but as a corporation. A key with this note about the organization is that if you have 10 plants, they could actually refer to the same corporate plan, the enterprise-wide or organization-wide plan. And purchasing, also a different process for purchasing from non-approved suppliers. So say you've got an emergency or something like that, then you've got a way that you're you're going to be handling that product and controlling as it comes in. Now you can buy from non-approved suppliers. You just have to have an extra step to make sure that and confirm that they are that they're meeting all of your other requirements. So for the user itself, so say a food company buys the package, it's been purchased properly, and now it's in process. So this is not specifically defined in this Part 3 because Part 3M is on the production of packaging, but it is defined in other parts of the HACCP, TACCP, and VACCP requirements across GFSI. And the bottom line is that all of GFSI requires that you conduct an assessment for all hazards, and you have a plan for the hazards that are bad, and then you monitor along the way to see if there are any changes. So the package does have a role throughout the supply chain. So for those that don't believe it's really in there, this is the exact requirements from the text. This is something that is more, you know, auditable. So saying that this specific section, that you could look at this and say yes or no. Does the company, for the first one, have a documented threat assessment? That's key, documented and threat assessment. And the organization part of it is saying that there could be one for the entire corporation. You know, entire soda, a beverage company could have one for the whole corporation if there weren't anything unique about each plant. So they can refer to this, but a documented threat assessment. Second is food defense plan. Something you'll notice here again is for the whole organization, documented, and then mitigate the risks, to have a plan for those threats you identified. And finally, require that defense plan fit into the overall food safety management system. So you've got this overarching system, and within it are different aspects of food safety, food defense, and food fraud. So what you might do is, so say you're a manufacturer and you're looking at it, you could then go through and ask yourself, you know, do we have this threat assessment? Yes or no? Is it documented? Yes or no? Now, look, there's not much detail here. That's a real key. There's not a whole lot of detail. So that's something just to keep an eye on. That at this point, there's not a lot of requirement to meet the compliance. Second is food fraud. So food defense is someone's attack with the intent to harm. Food fraud is the action for economic gain. We'll get into this much later here, or a little bit later. But again, you'll see something very similar. The text is almost identical. Food fraud vulnerability assessment. So remember, for food defense, it's a threat assessment. For food fraud, it's a vulnerability assessment. A documented vulnerability assessment. And really, all it's asking here is yes or no. It doesn't even say that it's a, you know, it doesn't say it's a good one or a thorough one, but just that you have one. And the standard shall require documented plan to mitigate the public health risks. So that's a key. And then finally, the thing that they just say is that the food fraud mitigation plan does again fit into the food safety management system, talks about it together. So I went through real briefly and completely confused you, I'm sure, or in many cases, because we just kind of went through these topics without introducing them yet. But the key that we wanted to hit first is to let you see, or to lead you to see, that GFSI directly addresses food packaging, manufacturing, production, the materials, the functionality, before it even gets into the system. So we'll now take a little step back and go and look at the overall concepts and background on food fraud and food defense. And at the end, we'll have the very specific basic audit requirements and 7 questions that really could be a simple audit, and why it is that's the most efficient first step. So we're an academic institution. We teach, that's what we do, curriculum. And you'll see on the right this cycle: research, education, and outreach. So us talking to you is outreach. If we don't address a lot of questions here, please feel free to contact us. You'll see our website and information all over this, because we want to and need to connect. So we'll come out with outreach and we'll talk about the product. We learned things this morning in a webinar. We learned things last night in a discussion with a company. We're constantly getting new insight, and that leads us back to research, to then really decide, you know, look into, identify the questions, and then really study them. And then that leads into education, which is our more of our graduate courses, which then leads to content back up for outreach. And one of the main things we do with outreach is things like this, with a webinar for training. But we have a course, and they're MOOCs, massive open online courses. We have a food fraud overview MOOC that we offer twice a year that'll end up being on demand shortly, so anybody can hit it anytime. We have a food fraud audit guide MOOC. So as an auditor or as a certification body, you need to have some level of education and assessment for your auditors to meet GFSI compliance, really to meet FSSC, to meet GFSI. But that's something that's been put together for this audit guide MOOC. And something to emphasize is this is free. The content is always free. You can forward this to anybody, use it. It's publicly open, so the content is free. We do have a fee, a $100 fee for a certificate of completion if you need to have some type of record of it, which an auditor would need to have some type of record. And so that's the Food Fraud Audit Guide MOOC. And then next we have a Food Defense Audit Guide MOOC. Actually, we did the lecture last Tuesday. The second lecture, live lecture on the Food Fraud Audit Guide MOOC, that's been recorded and it'll be posted online in the course. And then the Food Defense Audit Guide, we did the lecture this morning, which is actually the second one. And we'll have those monthly for a while because there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of auditors, internal, external, and companies trying to meet compliance. So that's our basic programs. And then we do executive education, short courses. These are on site, more focused, more on the implementation. We have online graduate courses. So these are real Michigan State graduate courses, 3 credits. It's not like sitting back watching Discovery Channel. It's really for this deeper education that people need. And we have 5 that deal with food safety and food fraud in one way or another. And if you take 4 of those, you could get a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. And this is really something to help people that are managing this inside a company, or maybe you have a subject matter expert in your certification body or in your certification program, and you need somebody to have a broader understanding. That's what we've set together for this graduate certificate. And then if you like the program and the credits are fine, you can keep going. You can roll this into a Master's of Science in Food Safety. And this is a real Master's of Science. It's not just online, executive, whatever version, professional version. It's a real Master's of Science. It's all online. Defining food fraud. So I've led you along the path to understand that food fraud is required, but in a way we haven't even defined it yet. So food fraud is illegal deception for economic gain using food. That is the simple and short version that really covers everybody's broad definitions, except the US FDA. US FDA has a working definition that they say is economically motivated adulteration, and that would be a subcategory then, because that is then a substance for economic gain. That's the detail. So the broader definition is consistent with GFSI, ISO, the EU, China, and others. So really this broad definition of food fraud is used because companies and countries really need to focus on all types of fraud, not just one aspect. It would be like worrying about getting a broken leg, but not worrying about Ebola or something. So, or maybe vice versa. You really need to look at the whole patient to understand this. The motivation is economic gain. And that's the difference between food fraud and other things like food defense. For food defense, the motivation is traditionally harm or terror. It's trying to hurt somebody else. For food fraud, it's gain for yourself. With food fraud, there's always an economic threat, but there's not always a public health vulnerability. And that's why I think over the years, food fraud was something that just wasn't really hadn't been a real focus, because it's confusing. It's not a food safety control measures. This is crime science, criminology. These are things that happen outside the organization. It's more like protecting your house from being broken into than it is from protecting your manufacturing lines. There's a lot of different. It's just such a different beast, and that's why a lot of times the food public health systems couldn't respond, because they just didn't have the right tools. It would be like stopping everybody in the street everywhere to try to figure out if they were a mugger or not. You really want to look at the vulnerabilities. And that's the thing with food fraud. There's always a vulnerability. If you leave your front door open, you're more vulnerable to your house being broken into than if you close your front door. There's a wide range of incidents that we won't go into. But one thing that we'd like to point out is that this is an overview slide, and so it's one of those things that if you need to have a single explanation of the overall food fraud definition, this is a good slide to use. So what is food fraud? So to just give you a little broader perspective, these are all the different types of food fraud identified by the GFSI food fraud think tank. And up here in this area, we're adding tampering and overruns, but this area in the orange, this is where the FDA, the U.S. FDA is traditionally focused. This is where most of the public health threats will be, where a melamine is put into pet food and infant formula. But the key is that all types of fraud could lead to a public health threat, and all types of fraud can lead to economic impact for a company. And again, that's why GFSI took this broad focus. And this broad focus on all types of fraud is consistent with people like the UK, the EU, GFSI, China, ISO, and others. And actually, with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, if you remember, FSMA is in place in the US, but that didn't eliminate the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act still has adulterated foods and a separate section on misbranded foods. So the product may not have a public health threat, but it could still be illegal. And if you know that the product you're producing is illegal, that's a problem. That's a problem for you, and it's a problem for your company as well. So to look at that Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and this is looking at specifically FSMA, but in general, you need to conduct a hazard assessment regardless of whether there's a hazard that requires a preventive control. So what we mean by that is that how do you define what is a hazard that needs to be controlled and what's not? So you have to do a hazard assessment. That applies to packaging as well. But you could look at an entire range of products to say, since it's blown and it goes right into the bottle is blown, it goes right into a package that has an overwrap, then you could just say that all those types of hazards that could occur are such a low likelihood or consequence because of that process. You would define that, you would use that assessment to say this is a hazard that does not require preventive control. The second is that it must be documented. And then regardless of, you have to address all types of hazards, you have to address all hazards, so all types of fraud are included, and document this regardless of the outcome. And specifically from the Federal Register notice, the hazard may be intentionally introduced for purposes of economic gain. So that's not only the quote economically motivated adulteration, that's any type of economic gain. That could be stolen goods or others. Stolen goods that are mishandled would fall under that. And there's a wide range of rules here that are referenced for that. So when we look at the food risks overall, we look at all food risks, and they fall into 4 categories into 2 nice 2x2 matrix. First, food safety and food defense. These are things that we knew. We've dealt with these before, familiar in the past. When we started to deal with food fraud, and we started to look at the motivation and prevention, we found that food fraud was fundamentally different than these other types of food risks. And food quality is included in here because these are usually quality management systems, and they're maybe under a food quality group, but also food quality is a food risk that a company has, and actually that happens every minute probably, unfortunately. So that is one type of food risk. Again, the food risk could be economic or public health. So the column on the left defines unintentional actions. You don't try to create these problems. On the right, they're intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing and why they're doing it. For food defense, the intent is harm, public health, economic, or terror. For food fraud, the motivation is economic gain for themselves. So a disgruntled employee that puts a contaminant in a product and the product has to be recalled or cost of destruction, that harms the employer. That the person does not get economic gain for themselves. So that would be a Food Defense Act versus food fraud, which would be for their own gain. If they stole goods and then sold them, they would steal the product to sell it for economic gain. Now, under food defense is the concept of terrorism. And we see a lot in Europe now, there's a lot more focus on terrorism, and even the word food terrorism is coming up a little bit more. A key there is food terrorism is just, or terrorism is just a small subset of the Food Defense Intentional Act for harm. You think about malicious tampering or things like that, that would be, that's what happens a lot more often than a terrorist act. Terrorism is also a tricky word to use because although you think you know the definition of terrorism, we really need to look at the overall actual use of definitions, because it's important to look at how terms are used. You might think a term applies just by what you've seen, but we really need to look at the terms themselves, and we'll go through some of those. The wide-scale harm. So this is how FDA addresses the bigger issues. Is that they don't look at, in the intentional adulteration rule, they don't focus on all types of food defense actions. They specifically say not food fraud, not disgruntled employees. They're looking at wide-scale harm. So someone doesn't technically need to be a terrorist to be someone that had that motivation for wide-scale harm. They're looking for the big impacts. And economically motivated adulteration is again just an adulterant substance, and so that, using FDA's definition, is a subset of food fraud. So food fraud and EMA are not the same things. Now, really, in there is economically motivated misbranding as well. We probably ought to put that as a note. I made a note there, so we'll put that in there too. Now, GFSI, I mentioned this HACCP, TACCP, and VACCP concept. So we'll go into a little more detail here and present these to you. So overall, there needs to be a food safety management system. This is the overall way that we look at managing this risk. And the risk can be public health or economic. GFSI, as with FSMA, focuses on the public health, or prioritizes the public health. But with a company, you need to look at the economic impacts also. So on the one column, we have HACCP, which is the hazard analysis, and we're very familiar with that. 20 plus years in the system, unintentional acts, science-based, foodborne illnesses. And what GFSI said is that really, to control the system, to look at the root cause of these others, we need to have two separate assessments. And so food defense has a separate assessment and a separate plan that feeds up into the food safety system, and food fraud has a separate assessment and plan. For food defense, it's referred to as TACCP, or threat assessment, and this originally came from PAS 96, which earlier threats were all only food defense. A lot of our colleagues were from Europe, and so PAS 96 was something that was familiar. PAS 96 eventually expanded to include some types of frauds. So PAS 96 would have different requirements than GFSI, because GFSI specifically requires them being separate. So threat assessment is there for food defense, and for food fraud is a vulnerability assessment. And vulnerability is more of a concept used in crime science. When we look at a network or a system, their vulnerability to attack, and we want to reduce and prevent crimes by reducing the vulnerability. And so that's where vulnerability came in. Now later when things were evolving, the Food Safety Modernization Act refers to a food defense vulnerability assessment. So there could be some confusion there when you're talking about threat assessment or vulnerability assessment. Basically, what we recommend for companies is just to have a glossary of terms, or some type of, when the first time they use the term, they define their scope. Because an auditor coming in, you may read a term and not be exactly sure of what you may assume that they mean vulnerability assessment. You may assume in a GFSI audit that the company is using a GFSI terminology of a vulnerability assessment, but they may not. So it's important to look at those. Now, another note about this is it seems like there'd be 3 times the work if you have 3 of these systems. That's not the case. The TACCP and VACCP are so much smaller than a HACCP plan. The details. And in some cases, like for packaging companies, then it would almost be minuscule, infinitesimal, the amount of assessment needed there. So they would be much smaller. And also, it actually makes it simpler because you're dealing with one idea at a time. So that's what we're looking at. And so you want to split them out. It's much more efficient. Now, you may actually split out within TACCP. You may have 2 sub areas. You may look at employee theft and outsiders, or employees as a threat, and look at outsiders trying to infiltrate. That may be something that you do as well. So we covered the basic GFSI requirements for packaging, and this is how it looks. That packaging is very similar to the rest of the systems. So you'll see here that the organization documented vulnerability assessment. The organization has a documented plan to mitigate those vulnerabilities you identified in the first step. And then what's different is in the product section of GFSI, it's still the organization, but it looks at cover the relevant GFSI scope and supported by the system. But the relevant GFSI scope is all types of fraud. Key to say is, and this is really important for a packaging company, every vulnerability does not need a control plan. And you may identify a lot of them, but since you may be manufacturing that product, it might get to the food company when the bottles that you're blowing are still warm. It might be that quick. So when product is moving quickly and through your controlled supply chain, when you're looking at a lot of just-in-time inventory and monitoring, you're going to know when there's a problem with the product. So there may be a lot of vulnerabilities, but very, very few, if any, that really need to be mitigated, control plans. In that case, you would monitor them. Example we use is a meteor. So you sitting in your office right now, you could be hit by a meteor. So that's a vulnerability. Now that is a vulnerability that is so unlikely, even though the consequence would be so high, but it's so unlikely, and the cost of the risk treatment would be so high that no one would protect their facility from a meteor strike, or unless you're the Pentagon of some kind, or they'd then consider backup data that's someplace else or something. But you'd have to build your facility a mile underground to avoid a meteor strike of a meteor of any size. So that's an example of identifying a vulnerability. Now in a year, if we're all of a sudden having meteor showers or something, then there may be a different consideration as we start to see how these plans change. And that's what we want. We want to have these threats and vulnerabilities listed so that we assess them and then can decide whether they've changed from year to year. So basically, what you have in every type of management system, whether it's risk management, ISO 31000, whatever, you have a vulnerability assessment, some type of assessment, some type of plan, and some details. So we do recommend, so as an auditor going in, you may see a very high-level summary. And if a company really has their act together, they're going to have a one-page summary of the vulnerability and a one-page summary of the prevention strategy. And those, if you're asking the most basic questions, yes or no, then they'll show you that they have it, especially if they refer to something deeper. And then they'll have more below that, but they have this vulnerability assessment, the assessment, this strategy, and then they'll have some type of tweaking for details. So maybe with FSMA or with GFSI, it will say the relevant GFSI scope, then it should list the full scope of the types of fraud that they have in there. And as you ask the question, does it cover the relevant GFSI scope? You now know what those things are that are listed out. Actually, I'll make a note for us to list those. We'll expand the document to do that. So that's what you'll see. And the same with if it's FSMA, if it's Sarbanes-Oxley or others, you need some type of assessment and you have a control plan. And then there's some type of details in there. So if a company starts with something basic, that they can usually adapt it for, just tweak it at the end to make sure that it does cover everything you've got. Important to point out, the scope is the organization. So even if it's a site audit, you go to a manufacturing plant, that site, and you audit that plant. The GFSI requirements for food fraud and food defense are for the organization. So you do have the responsibility to ask about the full enterprise-wide assessment for the organization, and then how it applies also to this specific site. In a lot of cases, there will be like purchasing of cumin or something, that the organization may have the vulnerability assessment maybe at a corporate level, because they're choosing who to buy from at the corporate level, and then they may have control plans at the corporate level, like product that's moving through the system. Maybe they test it en route. Maybe they have a process with the quality control or lab at your facility that it tests it before it gets into production, or they have some type of master plan. So the key is that the site will ask for this overall plan for the organization. It does not need to be something specific for that facility. And also, really, if you're a facility, you shouldn't be doing your own vulnerability assessment by the site, because you probably don't buy cumin globally. You're not the group that goes or is accountable for auditing and visiting suppliers in Sri Lanka or something. So that's a real important point. So dun dun, here we go. This is the golden slide. See that? It's got the gold frame around it. So to highlight this as you're flipping through. So we've summarized. This has been in academic articles, peer review articles, summarized in blog posts and trade journals, as you'll see there. There's 7 questions. And we'll then, the next slide, we'll talk about why these 7 simple questions are the most efficient way for an audit to start, for an auditor to start. The big thing is we need the auditors to know they're supposed to ask these 7 questions, or so or more, but these 7 for GFSI compliance. And the companies need to know that they're going to be audited on them, because that means they're going to start to work on them. And I can tell you, for this last 10 weeks, since it's been a requirement, and over the last year as well, companies are now taking a very, very serious look at this and asking if they're compliant and if they have their systems in place. And I can also guarantee you, the minute that someone has a bad audit, a low rank on food fraud or food defense, they're calling panicked to figure out how to address it. That's the key. You asking that question will start the process, and we'll demonstrate that really in the next slide. But so the basic questions are, again, yes or no, conducted a food fraud vulnerability assessment. So what might happen is you might ask these questions at the beginning, and then go through the specific, say it's a FSSC 22000 audit or SQF audit. You then would go through the specific line by line items that they have, the questions they have. But you can start, if you start with these 7 questions, then it's gonna basically clear the way to know that the basic requirements have been there. Food fraud vulnerability assessment, yes or no, have they conducted one? And again, that organization-wide 1-pager is something that would make it real efficient for everybody to look at. Is it documented? Again, that 1-page publication. Implement a food fraud prevention strategy, yes or no? Is it written, yes or no? Now, at this point, and again, a key is to just get the process started. As long as someone has something that looks decent, just like it's somewhat formalized, as long as they have a method, then that's the right starting point. Later, we'll have a lot more insight on what types of methods are important, and which ones are more standardized, but we really don't have those yet. I mean, even us as researchers in the area, it's still, there's 1,000 different ways to get to the same goal. Minimally conduct an annual food fraud incident review. So if they just did their previous one, recently, then they will have done that. In the future, we'll have a lot more insight on what they use as triggers to see when they do an assessment again, what quarterly based on incidents or things like that. But right now, the requirements in GFSI and the standards are just at least minimally conducted annually. Note, address all types of food fraud, and we'll add to this the exact types of food fraud, but that's all types of fraud. Substances, stolen goods, smuggling, those are all specifically identified in GFSI documents as within the scope. This is where a lot of people stumble, because things like stolen goods or counterfeits, they say, oh, well, that's not us, someone else deals with that. Well, if you're the auditor looking at it, they have to convince you that, and demonstrate that they cover all types of fraud. To say that someone else is covering it is not demonstrating it. Now, if they say this is conducted by the corporate security group following ISO 28000 supply chain management, now you're getting somewhere. But then they would still have to say, show me, some confirmation that it's being covered. So at this point, it's yes or no. Is it covered? All types of fraud. And then last is address all products. That's across the organization. At the organization level is fine, from both incoming goods, ingredients, and outgoing goods, finished goods, through to the consumer. So if you're a food manufacturer, that's monitoring that product coming in, including packaging, to make sure that the products coming in are fine, but also monitoring your food packaging all through the supply chain. That would include, like, remember that box of antifreeze coolant that I have, to monitor the destruction of your packages, because those packages, there's a vulnerability that package could be used fraudulently. Now, we might figure out with antifreeze that might be low. Well, unless they have some kind of guarantees, then maybe there's some warranty claims, but that's looking through the product. For a packaging company, that's looking at the incoming goods. So anything that comes in, maybe you buy your caps, from somebody else, or you buy, lid stock or something like that from somebody else. Whether it's finished or raw materials, that would be controlling it coming in. And for a packaging company, the finished goods going out would be those bottles that have been blown with the labels on them. And we're asking the question of yes or no, does it address all types of products? And these have been in public documents, so it's real easy for people to find. So finally, before finishing, I think that you're probably concerned of how broad the scope is and all these new areas in packaging that you have to cover, new types of requirements like food fraud and food defense and criminals and terrorists and all this. And then you've seen these 7 questions and you're very skeptical and concerned that this simple set of questions is your optimal role of being a competent auditor. Well, people say it's just a checkbox, and we would say yes or no. And there's often that criticism that some audits are just a checkbox. Did it, check, done. Is this okay for food fraud and for this stage right now? Yes, it's okay, and it's actually optimal. And we'll explain why. Is the formal and official process has started. 10 weeks into it is all right now. Yes or no is the audit question. So you just asking the yes or no question, whatever they hand you, even if it's the simplest, craziest thing, if it's a vulnerability assessment and the second is a prevention strategy, then yes, they've covered that. If they did consider all types of fraud in all products, yes, they've covered that. So they've started, but the thing is that there's a whole series of events that occurs inside that company. So as you're getting ready to visit that person that's the host for you as the auditor, that person is creating the documents, pulling them together to prepare for an audit. Well, if they put together the food fraud vulnerability assessment, then they're not just going to write their own one and give it to you. They're going to give it to their boss to approve or check on these approvals. It's going to probably go into corporate compliance. We've seen it go to the general counsel's office to start to look at this because we're developing these products for the first time. And that's a real key, is that you confirming that you're going to ask those 7 yes or no questions starts a whole series of events. And what we've seen is that people that have been audited already, they may give you that 1-page summary, but you may say, hey, I think I'm going to ask for more next time. Or they themselves are saying, you know, we did get that, but we really need to start looking at what we're going to do to really fill this thing out, because they realize when they hand you a document, and this is becoming, it could be a legal document found in discovery, used in a court case, and that gets the entire series going. So we're 10 weeks into this, and again, things are going to change in 10 more weeks and 10 more months. We're doing these MOOCs and updating them monthly, so we're getting a lot of new information, and with the CBs and the CPOs, we will be communicating as we see new things. We're constantly gathering information. I just did a webinar for FSSC. We were at the SQF conference at the end of last year, going to be presenting at BRC with them, and just saw all of them, including IFS, at the GFSI conference in Tokyo. Met with GFSI, and so we've got a lot of activities that really are going on that are continuing to expand this, at least from our aspect, to look at the real core and the kernel of this, and then you've got things on top of it. With that, we're taking discussion questions. We haven't had any questions come up, so I think sometimes this topic is feeding you a glass of water with a fire hose. So there may be very new ideas. As you think about questions, my email information is there, our website's there, because we want to communicate with you. So it's not that we put it there and don't really want to hear from you. We do want to hear from you. So please do communicate with us or communicate through your companies, and we will then continue to take care of this topic. Thank you, and I will stop recording.